You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Shatton. Hi, everybody. Welcome to a special edition of Demystifying Organizations. I recognize that much of the audience is not affiliated with Washington and Lee University, which is where I'm a professor, though many of you are. And I'm going to spend this podcast specifically looking at the name Washington and Lee University. I'm hoping to showcase the complexity of organizations that are grappling with the changes that we see in 2020. There's nothing more central to an organization than its name. It's the first thing that a customer comes across, a potential employee, any stakeholder for that matter. The first thing that they see or that they interact with is the organization's name. And right now, my organization, Washington and Lee University, is grappling with its name. We carry the namesake of not one but two generals who were slaveholders. And in light of the current environment after the murder of George Floyd, the Washington and Lee University faculty voted 79% to remove Lee from the name. And the purpose of this podcast is to explore the implications of that, to explore the name. I'm bringing on three different voices who provide a unique perspective. One of them is going to argue that the name should stay exactly as it is. Another is going to argue that Lee should be removed from the name. And the third one is going to take the stance that both Washington and Lee should be removed from the name. I should give a full disclosure, which is that I voted to remove Lee from the name during the faculty vote. There was an opportunity to vote to remove Washington from the name. I voted that we should move on and just focus on Lee. So I declined to vote off Washington off the name. The purpose of this is not for me to put my opinion forward, though you will certainly hear it. I'm not going to shy away from my opinion, but rather to showcase the diversity of thought surrounding the changing of the university's name. And I think more broadly, it captures a wide-ranging approach to this very issue in other organizations. For example, we just saw the Washington Redskins change their name. We saw Woodrow Wilson come off of the Princeton Public Policy School. We are seeing this conversation really across the spectrum about what is a name. And I hope that what you get out of this podcast more than anything is a better depth of understanding of the varying perspectives that we're seeing at Washington and Lee, but also in other organizations as well. My first guest today is Professor Lucas Morel. He is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics at Washington and Lee University. His expertise is mostly centered around Abraham Lincoln, including a recent book, Lincoln and the American Founding, which was released this year on July 4th. Lucas represents one of the stronger voices from the faculty for keeping the name Washington and Lee as is. Without further ado, I bring to you Lucas Morel. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm really honored to have you come discuss this very important issue.
Glad for the invitation, and I think it's a fantastic idea.
So there's no greater honor in our society than to name an institution after another person.
Sure.
This is not a Rhodes Scholarship. This is not an honor roll. This is the preeminent thing that we give to anybody, is to name an institution that we care deeply about after someone. So given Lee's history with the Civil War, fighting for slavery, in many ways betraying the country, fighting against the nation, why should Washington and Lee keep his name on board?
Yeah, I mean, those are important observations to make. We could make more.
Yeah.
I think one thing that we really haven't done, or if we have, we haven't made it obvious or overt, is we haven't done exactly what you've said. To think about the honorific that it is to be a namesake, not for a scholarship, not for a sidewalk or a building. We're talking about the institution, okay? And so what I think we should do is to just stop for a moment and pretend our school had no names on it. And then ask this question. If we're going to add names to it, rather than be that university in Lexington, Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
that on our t-shirts, here's the question. For whom should our university be named? If it's going to have names, and we'll leave Washington to the side, okay? Let's focus on Lee.
Yeah, agree.
If our university did not have anybody's names, for whom should it be named? Now, we could name it, if we get the permission, of someone who we just think is super cool and may have had no connection to our university, but stands for things that we stand for, okay? Or, more directly, we could name it after people who made not just a contribution, not just an association with the university, but made signal contributions. As our advanced department would say, transformative contributions to the university. And for me, I believe both our current namesakes meet that threshold. And as I put it at our faculty meeting a week or so ago, I said, I cannot think of, if I had to name two people, and you realize, I mean, I should hasten to add for our listeners, I am a scholar of Abraham Lincoln. So he's my favorite.
Yeah.
My Twitter handle is...
There's a lot of irony there.
Yeah. My Twitter handle, I've been teaching at Washington and Lee for 21 years. My Twitter handle is Lincoln Douglas with 2 S's. So my second hero is Frederick Douglass, someone who I also teach every year. So those are my heroes. Throw that marker out there. I believe Lee is a traitor. Okay? So I dislike Lee for many, not all, but for many of the reasons everybody else dislikes Lee.
Okay.
He is not a hero of mine. But as I posed it to the faculty, I cannot think of, if I had to think of 2 people to name our university after, I cannot think of 2 people who made more palpable, substantive, and transformative contributions to the educational mission of our college than George Washington and Robert E. Lee. People can do the history on that. You can go on our website to find out what Washington did in donating those canal shares, which contributed to an early portion of our endowment, which still pays till today. And if folks don't know, Lee spent the last years of his life, the last 5 years of his life after the war's cessation, the Civil War cessation, as president of our university. He was instrumental in annexing a local law school to make it part of the university. He built Lee Chapel, designed the president's house, transformed the honor code. It was there beforehand, but he made significant changes to it. And he turned a podunk boys' school into a serious college that drew students from both north and south of the Mason-Dixon line, and saw it and understood it publicly as his civilian way of contributing to reconciliation. Right.
I think the question here is one about redemption.
Yes.
And how we think of redemption versus what things look like many years later. So let me just lay out a couple things, and where I think where we probably will significantly disagree. I do a lot of work with the Augusta Correctional Institute.
Okay.
So the inmates that are in my class, I take 10 W&L students to a medium security prison. They take the class with 10 inmates. I've done this now 3 spring terms. And I'm very familiar with redemptive stories. So I meet characters all the time that have a dark past, whether they, and these are inmates that are in for murder, they're in for armed robbery, they're in for, for a variety of crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And they are looking for redemption. And many of them do change their character and do end up on the other side and I've worked with a couple that have made their way out and they're now living a civic life. And we want to praise that and say, okay, we have a case of somebody who has what they did in their past, we have a lot of issues with. Let's say that they're in for murder. They acknowledge that they were in for murder. They have made it through a process. They are now 40 years later on their way out in another state of their life, and we're now going to treat them as such.
Right.
So a classic example of redemption. There's a very big difference between those inmates. And we could pick on any redemption story. It's just the one that came to mind.
Sure.
Versus Lee, where we can acknowledge his foibles, we can acknowledge his contribution. But there's a very big difference between the inmates who come out and on the other side are working in jobs and living a life versus naming an institute after someone. And in my mind, and I think for many, and I'm not even getting into the current issue, there's something, if someone does something so horrendous, in many ways, it makes it where the naming of an institute after them becomes invalid.
No, that's great. I think that's a fantastic setup. And I love the fact that you brought up that term. It is a term we get from the Christian religion, Christian theology. The idea that no matter how heinous, I mean, good grief, you brought up murder. Wow. Okay.
Which Lee is responsible for plenty.
Okay. But I mean, just murder, one is bad enough.
Yeah.
Catholics think that's a mortal sin. According to the Christian faith, there is no sin so heinous that it cannot be given if you truly repent, and if you bear, as the Bible says, if you bear fruit in keeping with repentance. So let's just get the concept there. That's what redemption means. Okay, a price has been paid and has led to the liberation of someone who should have paid that price. Okay, all right. Do I believe honoring Lee is part of redeeming his legacy as the patron saint of the lost cause? No. Full stop. I do not believe 5 years, the last 5 years of his life, is meant to be understood. I do not understand those years and his contributions to the university as a sufficient wiping away of the sin of fighting against his country, a country he was offered leadership of. He was actually asked by the general-in-chief on behalf of Lincoln to lead the Union Army, and he turned it down. So it's not just that he fought for Virginia. He actually had the opportunity to fight for his country, and he chose not to. In my opinion, that was a bad decision. Okay. So I do not view honoring Lee as a way of acknowledging that he has been redeemed for owning slaves, which he eventually freed. I don't see it as an act of redemption. I don't tie those two together. What I am trying to get people to see is the reason why I think his name should remain on the masthead is simply because of his ties to the university being so substantial and transformative. I don't think we should presume what any person of color, as we say today, thinks, feels about being associated with a college named after two slaveholders, one in particular who fought to destroy the thing that the other one fought to establish. Okay? I think we need to not presume upon anybody in terms of what their impressions are of Lee. I would hazard to guess that for a good number of them, what's more important to them was the actual experience of a student at WNL or a faculty member at WNL. What does it feel like teaching at WNL? What does it feel like learning at WNL? Rather than presuming that because they're named after two slaveholders, they must feel abhorrence towards one or both of them. That the fact that they came to a school named after two slaveholders, one of whom fought for white supremacy, leads me to believe the name was not a big enough turnoff to dissuade them from even applying, let alone enrolling. And so for me, the experience as a student, the experience as a faculty member, now let's have a discussion. Now let's talk about the ways in which, do we really memorialize the Confederacy at WNL? I've been there for 21 years. I don't see it. Students are not required to learn anything about Lee, which in part I think is a mistake. They should learn about Washington and Lee, but there is no required course. There is nothing that we do that champions the cause of the lost cause of the Confederacy, that hails Lee for all the things we do not like about him. As the previous president, Ken Ruscio, he said that what we celebrate here is Lee the educator.
So I think all that, of course, is true, right? That the experience of someone is more important than the name of an institution. But I think that has some of this backwards, which is the name of the institution. When somebody comes here, whether that's a faculty or a student, there might be 20 or 30 things that they're juggling that sit in a pro and con list. And of course, it's the case that the name is not the only thing that somebody is considering, but it's a factor. And as we build a 21st century institution that's with diversity at the very front of the strategic document that we're putting out, how many people does the name, and I'm asking a question I don't know the answer to, but given that the name carries a lot of weight because it is the first thing anyone knows or sees or thinks about, how many people, and especially of minorities, or does this university go from the yes column to the no column?
We have over, 6,000 incredibly qualified students who apply to our university every year. We have zero problem attracting students to Washington and Lee University. Why is that? The reason why our demand is so high is our gates are not open to 330 million Americans. Our gates are open to the top graduates of high schools across this country. And you know what they know? They know the rankings. And in the rankings, even if we're not an Ivy or Stanford or Duke, MIT, Caltech, you name it, we are known sufficiently among students that not only are Washington and Lee known as slaveholders, not only are they known as a builder of a nation of freedom and a fighter against that nation on behalf of white supremacy and slavery, we are also known as a very prestigious liberal arts college. I guarantee you, without even asking, that the vast majority of faculty who came to Washington and Lee knew that before they took the gig, knew that before they applied, and ditto for students who apply here. And so for them, you're right, there is a whole list of reasons why they should take the gig or even apply. What I don't like about it, maybe I'm not big on fly fishing or mountain climbing. And boy, rural small town, that's kind of tough. The closest big city is Charlottesville. I got to hop a mountain for that, blah, blah, blah. Airport, Dulles is 2.5 hours away. Are you kidding me? Okay, so there's a whole list of that. But one thing that is not mentioned, and that the trustees were good to mention in their announcement yesterday or the day before, that a committee has been formed to discuss what should be done, if anything, about the name and the implications, et cetera, is that we have built a brand, not on white supremacy, not on the lost cause. We have built a brand of being one of the best, top, close, when was the last time? Was it 11, 12? Where are we now? But we have built a brand well into the 21st century of being one of the elite 30 liberal arts colleges in this country. Faculty know it, prospective ones, students know it. And so the brand isn't just, we're named after slaveholders. The brand is that school named after slaveholders is really good at what they do, which is not to promote slavery, but to promote, and here's my synopsis, my paraphrase of the university mission statement in 10 words: to think, do good, and help others do the same. I think that's about 10 words. I talk about our mission statement. I talk about our diversity statement with my students every year, okay? We are known for doing, here's my last point. We are known for doing that, not just competently. We are known for doing that exceedingly well. And therefore, faculty choose not just to be hired here, but the vast majority of them, as I describe it to people that we're interviewing in my department in politics, we are a hire and retire kind of place. I'm not saying that people haven't left, but I'm saying a goodly number Most people come to WNL and do not see it as a stepping stone to all those other fancy colleges I mentioned. They see this as a place they will spend the rest of their lives. Why do they do that? Why do they think this should be the place where they reach the full flowering of their careers, raise their families, and publish their best work, teach these great students, and get along with awesome colleagues like Professor Shatton, right? They do it because our brand does not represent white supremacy. Our brand does not promote the lost cause. You know what our brand represents? The mission I just mentioned to you, and that we are an elite liberal arts college, one of the top colleges in the United States. That's the brand.
It gets back to why somebody comes here. Of course,
Yes.
We are complex creatures with a ton of different things that bring us to any organization and out of other organizations.
Sure.
So a name is not it, but it's not the only thing. Do you think that it does impact the very real situation, which is we struggle to attract diverse students and attract and retain diverse faculty?
I want the data on the kids who came in spite of the name and are rankled by the fact that we are, quote unquote, still named after that slaveholder, let alone both slaveholders. I want the data on the claim that we struggle primarily because we are named after, in part, Lee, rather than we struggle because we are in rural West Central Virginia, where the shops close up at 5 o'clock and there is no bustling nightlife on the weekend except for fraternity and sorority parties.
What would it take for you to be convinced that the name would change? Like, what would the data? Because you want data. What would come out where you would say, "Oh yeah, no, that this has to go"?
You got to show me that of the pool of students who could do well at WNL, that a good fraction of those students aren't even applying because they're turned off from the name. That would be probably top of my list.
Okay. Is there anything that it would take for current students or current faculty that you would rethink this if they responded with issues with the name?
I would want to know why they still came here. Why was the name not that important, push come to shove, when it came to actually being employed at a school named after two slaveholders? Washington and Lee is a brand.
Sure.
It is a prestigious brand. And the trustees would be fools to throw that prestige away by renaming us in a fashion where people would think we disappeared from the map. What happened to that really cool elite top 30, top 20, top 15, top 10 liberal arts college somewhere in the South? Wait, was it West Virginia, Georgia? Where was that school? They would be fools to do that, in my opinion. And so that brand, let me get to my real point here, which is in response to the thing that you just mentioned about all these students you talk to. I will wager you, if they had to make a binary, as you put it, name, student experience on campus at WNL, which has been the greater challenge, difficulty, distraction, the thing that has brought them inner turmoil, which one has bothered them more?
Yeah, we know that.
First year students or once they graduate. I bet you not 9 out of 10. I'd love to see the data. I will bet you 10 out of 10 will say, you could call this name Lee's Wonderful Palace. And I would come here if this campus experience was better in the following ways. I would bet money that for them, the name is not important. In contrast, I mean, I'm setting up a binary, I understand it, but for them, it's the experience on campus, that the things that they believe are missing, either the sins of commission or omission. I think the name pales. And I think the controversy and the discussion over the name is simply the avenue or vehicle through which they are expressing legitimate grievances about the problems they have had, if they're faculty teaching here, if their students learning here. That's my bottom line.
Yeah, and of course, the experience is going to be stronger than the name. But names and artifacts and symbols and rituals, these are things that are. It's a way that an organization steps out to those who are not in the organization and says, "Here's who we are."
Yes.
And that's why we have a mission statement. That's why we have, when you have a website or when you have pamphlets, all those things are much more than just drawing attention. It's actually saying, this is who I am. And a name matters.
My point is, the brand was built with those names. It is known by those names. It is known by those names. And if you were to change that name, I think we would have a harder time attracting the sorts of students we want to attract, because we would lose the association with the prestigious education that goes on at our university that was not the product of yesterday or a year or my 21 years at WNL. This is a thing that has been made over a century, in the making over a century. And that, I think, is too much to throw away by saying Lee has just become too heavy, a drag on our mission.
All right. Well, on that note, really, this has been awesome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeff.
This has been a great conversation. I've loved it.
Awesome questions.
My next guest is Professor Jim Casey. Jim is a professor of economics at WNL. He earned his PhD at North Carolina State University. Jim has been spearheading the movement from the faculty side to remove Lee from the name Washington and Lee University. So I present now my conversation with Jim Casey.
Jim, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast and to have this very important conversation.
Thanks, Jeff. I think this is going to be fun, and you're right. It's a really important conversation.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, the biggest decision this is what we're facing, the biggest decision by the university since desegregating the university and going co-ed. Can you give the overarching argument as to why you think Robert E. Lee should be removed from the name of the university?
Sure. So I think that the largest sort of overarching argument is that Lee, regardless of what you think of him as an individual, which people will debate ad nauseum, is the strongest symbol for the Civil War, the Confederacy, the lost cause narrative, the breakdown in Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era. And so I think that the name itself is symbolic of a racist past, a racist present, and continuing into a racist future. And I think what we're seeing is a ground shift in the United States post the murder of George Floyd, and continuing to keep Lee as the name, the representative, the symbol, the signal to the world that that's what you value, I think is a very, very dangerous signal to send to the world.
Why is this so dangerous?
Because it is the incarnation of racism in America. If you look at the way the statues, the Confederate flag, his name, everything related to Robert E. Lee in present time is used to send a signal of where you stand on issues of race in America. The Confederate flag has been co-opted by the Make America Great Again crowd. The Confederate flag, we've seen it fly when Dylan Roof brutally murdered 9 innocent Bible studiers in Charleston. And so Robert E. Lee is the general of the Confederate States of America's army. So I just don't see how you separate and somehow think that you can honor him for his 5 years of service to the university. And even that's problematic if you actually look at the historical record and the way students behaved at that time. This was an institution for white Southern men for the 5 years that he was here. He made no attempt to do anything beyond that. He accepted abhorrent criminal behavior on behalf of the students in terms of the way they treated freed slaves in Lexington. And so even the argument that, well, we're only honoring him for his 5 years as president, I find that incredibly problematic because those 5 years, if you actually look at the history, they're disgusting and disgraceful in terms of his approach to running a university strictly for white Southern men. I mean, quite frankly, the biggest argument I have heard from different people is that we need to honor both George Washington and Robert E. Lee for their tremendous contributions to our university, that it wouldn't be as today without them. And if that's the rationale for honoring them, then I can think of 80 plus individuals who actually gave more to the university, and their names, right, appear on that plaque next to Chavis Hall now. They gave way more than either George Washington or Robert E. Lee. So if your logic is to honor people who have given the most to our current university, then name it after two of the enslaved people on that plaque.
What do we do about Robert E. Lee, who is buried on our campus? There's a family crypt. There's Lee Chapel. There's the Lee Museum. What do we do about his physical presence and historical connection to this university after, let's assume, the name gets taken off? What happens then?
Yeah, well, the Institutional History Commission, one of its recommendations was to rename Lee Chapel simply Washington and Lee Museum, and make it a place for tourism and educational purposes to tell the full history of their connection to the modern institution as it is today. And there's where you could learn potentially about their contributions, the James River Stock gift, the development of the journalism school, et cetera. And I think that would be perfectly fine to turn Lee Chapel into a museum named after both of them, for it no longer to be a place where the university community gathers for public endeavors. And in terms of the actual physical remains, Jeff, there's a lot of legal issues, I think, there in terms of exhuming and moving and things of that nature. And
it seems really complicated.
Yeah, and I can't speak to it.
Are you concerned about the knock-on effects of this? So I've heard some people talk about the endowment issues that could come up, fundraising drying up. Are you worried about some of those issues?
Again, it depends on what part of the alumni base you talk to, because the individuals who are claiming that they'll never give another dime to the university or they'll pull pledges and so on. But I think there's a whole untapped group of alumni who are younger right now, so the time frame for their giving is longer. And we don't know what the net effect is going to be in terms of fundraising and the endowment, given that many young alums don't participate right now. And many that I have talked to say they never will unless the university changes in some very dramatic ways and becomes a place where anti-racism, right, is promoted and acknowledged. So the fiscal question, I think, is a really difficult one. I don't think there's any way to know what the answer is there. But I have heard both arguments. They tend to come from very different generations of alumni, as you might imagine. I think the interesting thing there, Jeff, is that when you talk to the younger alumni and when you talk to those of us who are on the side of Lee absolutely has to be removed, if Lee doesn't get removed, we have no intention to try to destroy the university that we love. We will continue to work towards positive change. And yet, it's not binary, obviously, but for simplicity's sake, the group that is saying, no, we have to continue to honor Lee, that group is threatening that if the name gets dropped, they'll never give another dime to the university, they'll never hire another intern, they'll never hire another employee, et cetera. And I find that to be a strange path to suggest that the institution and the education that we're providing for people is so valuable, but if we remove the name, you'll attempt to burn the place to the ground. That doesn't sound like a commitment to higher education to me. It sounds like a commitment to Robert E. Lee.
Could there be anything that could happen that would convince you that the name should stay the same?
I think if the alumni base and the community here in Lexington. I think that's something that we sometimes gloss over. And the faculty and staff and the current students and our potential future students were unanimous in their voice for Lee needs to stay, then you could make an argument that Lee should stay. I don't see that in terms of the actual evidence. But if that were the case, I could understand why the board might make a decision to keep Lee in the name. I would, of course, adamantly disagree with it on both a personal and professional level, but I think the board has some incredibly difficult decisions to make.
What about Washington? There's a movement within some faculty members to take Washington out of the name as well.
Yeah, and so I am personally, 100% sort of behind the folks who want to see that happen. I understand the rationale for it. I think it takes us into a very different conversation about America's history and America's present and America's future, given the status of Washington as one of the founding fathers versus Lee, who, by the way, was only a colonel in the United States Army. And the fact that we refer to him as General Lee is a nod to the Confederacy in and of itself. He was never a general in the United States Army. And so I think that it is possible to draw a line between those two. I often refer to Ty Sedul and his talk that he gave in Lee Chapel a couple of years ago, and a book that he's going to have coming out, Ty's class of '84, retired West Point historian and armored cavalryman for 33 years in the United States Army. And I think he provides quite an eloquent explanation, again, of his own personal view of being able to draw a line between those two individuals. I personally can draw that line, but I completely understand why it's impossible for others to be able to draw that same line.
So why are you advocating at this point for Lee and not Washington?
Well, I don't see Washington being paraded around in the alt-right racist rallies as their figurehead, whereas the Confederacy and Robert E. Lee has become the symbol of the most racist, vile movements in America right now that we see. And so, again, in my mind, I can think about the symbolism of both of them. Again, not necessarily their actual actions and behaviors, and on the front of owning other people. Brandon Hasbrouck has written very eloquently about this, and I agree with his feelings and his thoughts related to anyone who owned other human beings. Why would we honor someone like that? But at the same time, I think just to stick with the difference between Washington and Colonel Lee, I think that there is, again, in terms of the current day symbolism of both of those men, there's a stark difference between the two of them.
So I guess we're getting into the question here about the difference between how we remember people versus how they actually were, and then the legacy that they bring on versus what we actually know about them, right? So after somebody's died and we honor them, and there's nothing greater than giving somebody's name to a university or to any institution for that matter, it takes on a life of its own. And it actually would be different if Washington was in public discourse today known predominantly as a slave owner rather than the founding father of our democracy. And what do you think about that split between how we remember people as they lived versus how they actually were? And then how does that relate to the naming of institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just said, Jeff, is what, I guess, in my mind, in recognizing that, these views can be all over the place, and I'm receptive to hearing arguments from, all different perspectives. But the idea that Washington, again, as a current symbol, right, is best known, I would say, for the reality, right, of being the first president of the United States of America, of General Washington leading, right, the Revolutionary War. I'm not a historian by any respect, in any respect, but I think again that name connotates different things for different people, but primarily in the American psyche, which has a lot of problematic aspects for sure. But I think the primary connotation is as the leader of this newfound democracy, which is incredibly imperfect. Hopefully, that's what we're all working toward, is to extending the values and the rights of this experiment to everyone in this country. And Lee, I think, just unless you refuse to acknowledge the actual reality of Lee, if you just buy into, as Ty Sedul said, the mythology of the Marble Man, then there's just not much there that connotates anything positive in 2020 in the United States of America.
If we take Lee out of the name, I think, and that's all that we do, I think for many that would be a profound disappointment. Can you walk through what we would need to do after removing Lee from the name?
In my own mind, Jeff, I have a list that I've circulated with faculty and alums to generate a conversation. I've also shared it with the rector of the Board of Trustees and saying this is my own personal list. And I have ordered it intentionally so that it would spark discussion, because people will disagree about what the priorities need to be. But for me personally, it's issues related to faculty hiring and retention, student retention, and not just counting the number, for example, of Black students on campus, but getting to a point where this is their campus. And the recent readings of Instagram posts, Dear WLU, clearly signify that our campus environment is not inclusive. As a matter of fact, it's very exclusive.
And what would an inclusive campus look like?
I think an inclusive campus would be one, to me, quite frankly, where, and I think it would be hard to know initially, but if alums in large numbers, Black alums, LGBTQ plus alums from lower socioeconomic status, like myself, I was a Pell Grant kid. If we felt proud of the institution, if we felt like we were actually part of a family of learners, then I think we would have achieved that. How we get there, I think, is issues related to potentially working with the Posse Foundation, having cluster hires for Black persons and Latinx community, et cetera, groups that are historically underrepresented minorities, and not just, again, hiring, but making sure that the voices. So a friend of mine recently said, diversity is spaces, inclusion is voices. And we don't seem to be doing very well on the voices front.
And so how do you create a culture? This is getting to some deep stuff, right? Which is these can't be mandated. It's not going to be a policy prescription that enables voice, right? This is much deeper seated than that. Getting into culture. So how do you craft a culture that allows for voice?
I'm not an expert in that area. Again, based on what I know, a lot of times individual voices go unheard. Particularly if there's not a recognition, right, of other people who look like me, dress like me, act like me, is very difficult for those minority voices to be heard. And so I think if there are first larger numbers, which that can be done, and then we need some truth and reconciliation on this campus. People are going to have to come together, faculty, staff, administrators, students, and have honest conversations about the types of things that lead to exclusivity. One of the primary ones on our campus, I think as many people are aware, is the Greek system and its dominance over social life. And the fact that, for example, students a couple of years ago thought that it would be funny to hold a DACA party where white students dressed up in sombreros and put on, multicolored shawls and fake mustaches and pretended to be Mexicans who were being forced to leave the country. That just cannot be socially acceptable. And you're right, it can't be mandated out, but there has to be a shift to recognize that if someone has that idea, hey, it'd be fun to have a party like this, there should be enough voices and representation to say, no, that's not acceptable. We're not going to have a party like that.
So if I can offer just a counterpoint, which would be the number of faces really does change things. And that, of course, it's not everything. But we're in a fortunate position, right? Unlike in a corporation, where if you want to change diversity, it is actually a very slow process because you have people that are there for 30 years, 40 years. It's not the case with students, right? They're only here for 4 years. So thankfully, you can turn a culture so much quicker with the student body. It takes a lot longer with faculty. But with the student body, you can churn culture relatively quickly because in a 4-year span, there is nobody who was there from the time before. What do you think about the argument that I've come across, which is as follows: just leave the university name as is and change the underlying university. Like, just go deeper, change the culture, change the hiring practices for faculty, change the recruitment process for students, and let's just leave the name alone.
Sure. So I think that argument is it's naive, quite frankly. I see, if I think about it, right, the econometrician in me, we have the variable of interest, which is becoming a 21st century liberal arts institution that values diversity and inclusion, is a place where every member of this community feels as if it is their community, right? Mm-hmm. And I think two of the potentially causal, right, variables are the name of the institution and then all these other things that you're referring to. And they're running sort of parallel to each other. And the idea that you could do one without the other, I think that they are covariates that are interlinked as well. I think it would be very difficult to do all of the things on campus that we want to do if we're still honoring Lee. Not that it couldn't be done. Obviously, you don't know until something gets tried, but I think it just makes it more difficult, and it still continues to send a signal of what we value. And so by saying we value diversity and inclusion, but we want to honor Robert E. Lee, but we only want to value the good things that he did, I just find that disingenuous. And I think it's so transparent that young people and their parents can see right through that. So it will make the other things much more difficult. I actually received an email from a classmate a couple of weeks ago that was very, very polite, very cordial, but arguing, right, that if we drop Lee, here are the kinds of things that will happen. And this individual actually wrote in his email, white, wealthy Southern families might no longer want to send their children to W&L.
Wow.
And I just thought,
yeah,
okay, like, is that problematic? Obviously, in this person's mind, that was very problematic. But if what we're trying to do is to value every individual who comes to this campus the same, and if, again, not my words, his words, white, wealthy Southern families decide based on a name change that they won't send their children here anymore, to me, that's indicative of the underlying problem.
Yeah. And I guess one final question. What's been the general response? You've been talking to the media. You've been back and forth with a million alum and students and faculty. If you were to, do you have any kind of thread that you think is going across the comments?
So I would say that 90% of the comments that I've received from alumni, both in my age cohort, which I graduated in 1991, so people can do the math on that one, Jeff, and then my former students, some of whom are now in their early 40s and some of whom are still in their early 20s. The response has been overwhelming in terms of this should have happened a long time ago. What can we do to facilitate change? They're writing letters to the president. They're writing letters to the board. They're forming, Zoom conversations within their own communities. So leaders of alumni chapters have reached out to me and said, what should we be doing? What should we be talking about? And then I've received just a slight amount of the occasional. I think my favorite was I was told to stick Robert E. Lee up my ass, which I'm not sure how I would go about doing that, but that was one of my favorite comments.
Yeah.
I've been told that I should leave the university, that I should be grateful that I have a job. Basically the kind of shut up and dribble comments that Laura Ingraham directed at LeBron James.
Huh.
I think it's important that we don't shut up and dribble. So, to summarize, most of the feedback I've gotten has been incredibly positive, but there certainly has been some hatred and vitriol as well.
All right. On that note, thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Yes, thank you, man. I love the way you ask questions and the way you do follow-up questions and so on. It's been a lot of fun for me.
Cool. Thanks.
All right, man.
Cool. Thanks.
All right, man.
And my final guest today is with Brandon Hasbrouck. Brandon is an assistant professor of law at Washington and Lee University. He also got his JD here at WNL. His area of expertise is criminal law, criminal procedure, constitutional law, federal courts, and appellate advocacy. I brought him on the podcast because he's been the most public of faculty members on the name change issue. He's penned an op-ed in the Washington Post. He sent an email to all the faculty laying out the grounds for removing Washington and Lee from the university name. And I thought he would round out our trio of perspectives. So here is Brandon. Brandon, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
My pleasure.
So I've spoken with a couple other the key faculty figures about the name change, and you wrote an op-ed that made it to the Washington Post. It's a really insightful, deep take on this, in which you say, both the namesakes of Washington and Lee University perpetrated racial terror. The schools should be renamed. So just walk me through an overview. Why should both Washington and Lee be removed from the university name?
Sure. So as background, in my frame that I work through and that I encourage our faculty and the Board of Trustees to work through is this. I think that our community, first I think America, and its institutions, need to engage in truth and reconciliation around race to facilitate healing. As part of the truth-telling process here at Washington and Lee, I think we need to confront our history with race, and we must engage in that history more honestly. If we do that, the conclusion is this: both Washington and Lee were perpetrators of racial terror, and for that reason should be removed from the university's name. Now, that's a necessary beginning, and I'll make the case why both should be removed. But truth and justice requires that we not bypass institutional actors. Indeed, institutional racism is created and sustained by such actors, which includes the predominantly white faculty at Washington and Lee. In order to move forward, in my view, which the Washington Post also tackles, and indeed to transform our institution, I believe the faculty must acknowledge its significant part in perpetuating white supremacy and engage in genuine and continued work that advances racial equality and justice. Now,
so I want to interrupt there. I want to start. I want to get to the faculty bit in a minute. I want to start just with the name stakes. Let's start at that piece, and then we can move to the
sure. No, sure. So now when we talk about Lee, I think that case, which everyone has made already, it's an easy case to make. He was the general of the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Many, include myself, call him a traitor. He was a slave owner too. Lee believed in his work and in his writing and in his speeches that Black people were inferior and that slavery was, quote, necessary because Blacks needed, quote, instruction, discipline, and leadership. His reputation for racial violence and hatred is also well documented. Black bodies were desecrated and skin mutilated by Lee himself, okay? And, look, he also, if slaves were able to survive his wrath, they likely ended up separated from their family by Lee's hand. Ta-Nehisi Coates described this as, quote, a kind of murder. Lee served as president from 1865 to 1870 of Washington College at that time. And Washington Lee celebrates Robert E. Lee's tenure as president for creating a world-class liberal arts program. But what stands out to me is that his students were sexual predators. They often sexually assaulted local Black schoolgirls. They also formed their own chapter of the KKK. So that's his legacy. Now, Washington is different. And I've already heard a bit about why should Washington's name stay?
There's two arguments out there. The first argument is that Washington donated $20,000 in stock to Liberty Academy when the school was about to close its doors. So it saved Washington Lee University. All right, that's the first argument. The second argument on why Washington's name should stay is essentially he was the first president. He had to lead during uncertain times, and he only had impossible choices before him. My argument against the first point is this. Well, he accumulated his wealth on the backs of Blacks. That enabled him to donate the $20,000 in stock. You can't disconnect the two. They are related. My response to the second point about his impossible choices is this. First, let's assume for a moment that I agree with that frame, right? Let me explain the easy choices Washington had. He didn't have to choose to have his wealth accumulated by human trafficking and bondage. He didn't have to engage in that activity. Indeed, the second president, John Adams, and his wife, Abigail Adams, were abolitionists. He also didn't have to choose to beat his enslaved Blacks, literally mutilated the Black body. He didn't have to choose to separate enslaved families. He didn't have to choose to sign laws in place that led to Black lynchings. Also, he could track down his runaway enslaved Blacks. He didn't have to choose to have his dentures made from pulled teeth of his enslaved Blacks. And he didn't have to choose to allow his adopted son to rape enslaved Black women on his estate. That's not leadership, in my opinion. That was then and is now a monster.
And given all that, and you put it in really amazing terms, how should we think of leaders in terms of the times that they live in, given the ethics of the time, and then how do we bring that forward in terms of our own age?
Sure. Well, let me first address the premise in the question, which I don't agree with, which is this, is that it was normal to own human beings. It just wasn't. There was abolition movement going on then, and George Washington could have made a decision not to own humans. Now, to the current critique, including critiques of my Washington Post article, is that, hey, look, Brandon, you're trying to erase and cancel culture. Well, I want to be honest, I find that objection to be quite amusing. Here's why. That is white supremacy. As background, erasure refers to the practice of collective indifference that renders certain people and groups invisible. The casualties historically of erasure constitute familiar castes: women, people of color, queer, poor. Unlike what whites have historically done to the most vulnerable, I'm not erasing Washington from our history. we are acknowledging that his accomplishments cannot outweigh the evils of slavery.
Okay, so that's the crux of it, which is unlike I agree that Lee is kind of a cut and dry area, but you think Washington is also pretty obvious. And the main argument is just what he did was so atrocious that it just outweighs any contribution to the university and, for that matter, any contribution to the country to have entities named after him. Is that more or less getting it?
That is more or less. I would refer back to my overall comment about, well, the donation and how I would frame that donation.
Were you at the meeting where we voted to remove Lee from the name?
So the faculty meeting, yes, I was at that meeting.
And did you vote to remove Lee or not?
No, I filed a protest vote.
Okay, so explain why did you do a protest vote?
Well, for a few reasons. One, before the meeting, I circulated a statement on the current resolution and petition just to remove Lee. Simply put, that's just simply not enough. What I contributed was something identified as systemic racism that exists at Washington and Lee, and I believe a systemic intervention is necessary. I provided that in my statement, which included removal of both Lee and Washington, and then 12 other additional proposals.
And so as a strategic measure, why not take a single when you have it, and then build off of that? And it's not that I disagree with any of your statements, but why not take Lee off and then use that as a starting point?
Sure. It's simple. One, that's just not anti-racist work. That is work providing faculty coverage to say, I'm not a racist. And I've made that case on why I think the predominantly white faculty is acting now instead of a year ago, 2 years ago, or 10 years or 20 years ago on Lee. And I believe it's a clear case of interest convergence. And my concern here is that faculty does the bare minimum, nothing changes, and then Black pain and suffering and desperation remains. And the faculty and the administration remains deaf to that. I want to address that. That is my priority, is that students and support professionals and professors are going to WNL, teaching at WNL, working at WNL, and they are being traumatized under the oppressive eyes of both Lee and Washington, and the culture that it has been created from those two.
And so it's not possible to start and take steps at a time. This is something that everything needs to be done all at once.
Sure, I think everything needs to be done all at once. Look, there's certain issues you can't compromise on as far as I'm concerned, and one of these issues is race. I am done compromising on race. We need to, as a university, be proactive in what we decide to do moving forward, and not reactionary.
What would you do about Lee's tomb?
So I'll leave it to the experts on how to properly remove those materials. I have no expertise in that area, but I think all honors of Lee, the statues, everything with the Confederacy, I think they could probably be removed to a museum for context. That's something I think the school is actually at least thinking about, the museum portion of it, not the removal of the tomb. But all in all, I think all of that should be addressed.
So let's think through a typical white faculty member who's not in a leadership position, right? They're just a professor. They do their research. They teach them classes. How can they better support students of color? And I think this is probably a statement that's not just about WNL. This would be other, largely white universities.
Well, first, I think they need to, all faculty members need to engage in anti-racist work. So depending on what your course is, you should be introducing your students to Black thought, Black leaders. There's been plenty of amazing Black thinking in all areas of education in our curriculum. Introduce students. I think faculty also needs to engage in racist thinking and tackle when students proffer racist thinking and racist policies. And I think so we need to get involved, so faculty should be involved in addressing that, right? So if a student says something racist, the faculty now is questioning, well, how did you get to that point? How did you get to that idea, right? And pushing back when necessary. That's part of being an anti-racist. So we should also be thinking about our core curriculum on the undergrad side. What courses? Students, as of now, my understanding is they could go through 4 years and not take any classes that engage in race. That is just wrong, in my humble opinion. So 3 things I think immediately faculty needs to be doing is faculty needs to be addressing kind of their curriculum. I think faculty needs to be engaging in anti-racist thinking and thought and dismantling racist thinking and policy perpetuated by their peers, the administration, and students. And then I also think that faculty should be listening better to Black stories and seeing and understanding what's going on campus. So be more involved, be more active would be the 3rd thing.
How has 2020 and George Floyd and all this, how has this shaped your thinking in terms of what kind of change is possible?
Well, this is what we're at right now. We're at a moment where we're asking ourselves this question: is it a movement or is it a moment? Mm-hmm. I sure hope it's a movement. That is my hope. Then again, we had those same conversations a few years ago, right? And a year ago, and 4 years ago, and 8 years ago, right? When we talk about Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, the list goes on. Sandra Bland. So is it a movement or a moment? And I think that's a question we all need to confront. And I sure hope that we engage in the hard work of anti-racism and to create a movement.
And what has been the feedback that you've gotten thus far from all your work this summer? What's the response been?
So for the most part, you get good responses. You get people saying, thank you. That's everything I wanted to say and more. And then, of course, you get the hateful, the racist, threatening emails. So I've been called the N-word plenty of times over again. I've been told, I'm better off as a slave, and that's my value. And so you get it all. And that's where we're at, 2020, to be a Black man with an opinion. That's the type of response. And not engaging in the intellectual endeavor of actually whether or not there's value in my arguments. They're going back to this other racist type thinking, and that's the problem.
And what's been the response from the WNL community, from the board? Have you talked to any of the people that kind of are going to be in the decision seat?
So no, I haven't had much engagement with the Board of Trustees. I'm sure they have my statement on these issues. I haven't engaged. I've been engaging with colleagues about how to move forward a more robust, institutional intervention that I hope gets pressed forward. But that's work our white colleagues need to do, and it's time. The ideas are there. I provided them a pathway forward. I hope they start listening and empowering and amplifying Black voices.
All right. You have any other thoughts you want to add to this?
No, thanks. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.